The family sent the ugly daughter as a joke, but she was what the rancher always wanted. The wagon that creaked to a stop in front of Jake Sullivan's ranch house looked like a hearse delivering its cargo. The driver sat hunched forward, reins held tight, his face turned away from the woman wrapped in a threadbare gray shawl who sat behind him like a piece of unwanted freight. When she finally stepped down, moving carefully to favor her left side, Jake saw what her family had done. They'd sent him their damaged goods daughter to fulfill a bride contract, expecting him to take one look at the fire scars that ran from her temple to her jaw and send her packing back to Wyoming Territory's most powerful cattle baron. But Jake Sullivan had seen enough broken things in his 42 years to know the difference between damaged and destroyed. The way she held her backbone straight despite the shabby treatment, the steady hands that gripped her small traveling bag, the clear intelligence in her eyes when she looked directly at him without flinching, these told a different story than the one her family intended. The driver didn't even wait for payment before snapping his reins and pulling away without a backward glance, leaving dust and the scent of his contempt hanging in the high plains air. As Jake stepped forward to offer his hand in natural courtesy, he realized something her family had missed entirely. The woman they'd thrown away like refuse was exactly what he'd been praying for. Someone who understood that real worth isn't measured by a pretty face, but by the courage to keep standing when the whole world wants you to fall. What her family didn't know was that Jake Sullivan had learned to see past surfaces during 4 years of cavalry service, and what he saw in Margaret Whitmore's eyes made him wonder if they'd just made the most dangerous miscalculation of their lives. The high plains wind cut across Jake's ranch like a straight razor that evening, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of weather. He'd been expecting this day for 3 months, ever since he'd signed that contract with Silas Whitmore. Water rights in exchange for a bride. Simple business, or so he'd thought. "I reckon you'll want to take a look before you decide," Margaret said quietly as they stood on his porch, her voice steady but resigned. She'd told him to call her Maggie when he'd asked, and the simple request had carried more dignity than most folks managed with fancy titles. "Most people do." Jake studied her face, not the scars, but her eyes. They held the kind of clarity that came from pain survived and lessons learned hard. "I've already decided, ma'am. Question is whether you can tolerate living this far from town with an old cavalry sergeant who talks more to his horses than most people." Something flickered in those clear eyes, surprise, maybe hope. She looked around the ranch, the sturdy log cabin with its covered porch, the well-built corrals where his horses stood quietly in the evening light, the vegetable garden that showed careful tending. This wasn't the crude bachelor's hovel her family had probably described. "Your letter mentioned you needed help with bookkeeping," she said carefully, pulling the worn shawl closer around her shoulders. "I taught school for 6 years before I came home." Jake nodded. He'd heard about the fire, about how she'd rushed back into the burning schoolhouse to save the children. What he hadn't heard, what no one seemed to talk about, was what had happened to her afterward, when she'd returned home to heal and found herself trapped in her father's house like a shameful secret. "Can you handle numbers and contracts, legal papers and such?" "Better than most lawyers." There was steel beneath the quiet words, and Jake felt the first stirring of real interest. A woman with education was rarer than gold dust out here, and one who could read the fine print might be worth more than all of Silas Whitmore's cattle. That evening, as they sat on opposite ends of his porch drinking coffee from tin cups, Jake began to understand what Silas Whitmore had really sent him. Not damaged goods, but dangerous goods. A woman with a sharp mind who'd been kept locked away like an explosive device that might go off if handled wrong. "Your family know you can read legal contracts?" he asked, watching her face in the lamplight that spilled through his kitchen window. Maggie's cup paused halfway to her lips. "Why would you ask that?" "Because a man doesn't usually send his daughter to fulfill a bride contract unless he's mighty sure she won't cause him trouble." Jake set his cup down carefully on the porch rail. "And you, ma'am, look like exactly the kind of trouble that might read the fine print." For the first time since she'd arrived, Maggie smiled. Really smiled. Not the careful half-expression she'd been wearing all day. "My father always said I was too smart for my own good." "Maybe so," Jake said, watching the sunset paint the plains gold and thinking about water rights and cattle baronies and daughters who knew how to read. "But around here, smart is exactly what I need." As they prepared to head inside for the night, Jake noticed a distant figure on horseback, silhouetted against the ridge that overlooked his ranch. The rider sat perfectly still for a long moment, then melted back into the gathering darkness. Someone was already watching, and Jake had a feeling their peaceful evening was about to be the last quiet moment they'd have for a long time. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving around his kitchen, and for a moment he reached for the Colt he kept beside his bed. Then he remembered. He wasn't alone anymore. He pulled on his clothes and found Maggie already dressed and working at his kitchen table, papers spread before her, and his account books open to pages he hadn't looked at in months. "Ma'am, you don't need to—" "These numbers are wrong," she said without looking up, her pen scratching corrections in neat, precise handwriting. "Your grain supplier has been overcharging you for 6 months. And whoever figured your property taxes didn't account for the mineral rights clause." She glanced up at him with something that might have been amusement. "How much coffee do you drink, Mr. Sullivan?" "Because at these prices, you could buy your own plantation." Jake poured himself a cup of the coffee she'd already made, better than his usual bitter brew, and looked over her shoulder at his books. In 2 hours, she'd found mistakes that would have cost him nearly a month's income. "How'd you learn to spot things like that?" 6 years of teaching gave me a good foundation in arithmetic," she said, still writing. 3 years of managing my father's household accounts after my mother died taught me how men try to cheat when they think no one's watching." They worked through the morning, her quick mind catching errors and inefficiencies he'd never noticed. Jake found himself watching her hands as much as the numbers. Steady, graceful, unmarked by the calluses that came from hard labor, but showing the ink stains of someone who spent time with books and papers. It was near noon when Tom Whitmore rode into the yard, and Jake felt Maggie go rigid beside him at the kitchen table. Through the window they watched her brother dismount and tie his horse with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who wanted everyone to know he was in no hurry. "I should speak with him," Maggie said, but her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there all morning. "We'll both speak with him," Jake said, and stepped outside first. Tom Whitmore was a younger, softer version of his sister, with the same intelligent eyes, but none of her steel. He looked at Jake with the mixture of arrogance and uncertainty that came from being raised as heir to an empire, but lacking the backbone to run it. "Mr. Sullivan," Tom said, touching his hat brim, "thought I'd ride over and check on my sister, make sure she's settling in properly." Jake noticed how Tom's eyes skittered away from Maggie's face, how he stood just far enough away to avoid having to look directly at her scars. "She's settling in fine, got a good head for numbers." "Yes, well," Tom shifted his weight. "The thing is, Mr. Sullivan, my father wanted me to make sure you understood the situation. Maggie's been through a difficult time since the fire. Sometimes she gets ideas, makes up stories. The doctor said it might be permanent damage from the smoke, you understand." "I understand plenty," Jake said, his voice quiet, but carrying the edge he'd learned in the cavalry. "Question is, what exactly are you trying to tell me?" Maggie stepped forward then, and Jake saw her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her skirt. "Tom means that if I cause any trouble, if I say things that embarrass the family, you should send me back immediately. Isn't that right, brother?" Tom's face flushed red. I didn't say." "You didn't have to say it," Maggie replied, and Jake heard the years of pain and anger in her voice. "You never do. Father just sends you to deliver his messages and expects everyone to read between the lines." "Now see here," Tom started, but Jake cut him off. "I think you've said what you came to say, Whitmore. Your sister's welcome here as long as she wants to stay, and what she says or doesn't say is between her and me." Tom mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "You don't know what you're getting into, Sullivan. My father doesn't like complications, and Maggie, well, she's always been complicated." After he rode away, Jake found Maggie sitting at the kitchen table with her face in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were dry but fierce. "Mr. Sullivan, there's something you should know," she said, reaching into her traveling bag. She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with her careful handwriting. "I haven't been idle these past 3 years. I've been keeping records." She opened the journal to a page filled with dates, names, and dollar amounts. "Every bribe my father paid to judges and politicians, every family he's ruined to steal their land. Every man who's disappeared after crossing Silas Whitmore." She looked directly at Jake. "And every time he or my brothers laid hands on me to keep me quiet about it." Jake stared at the pages of evidence, understanding dawning like cold morning light. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I realized he was never going to let me leave alive," Maggie said simply. "The marriage contract wasn't his way of getting rid of me, Mr. Sullivan. It was his way of keeping me under control while he figured out a more permanent solution." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the distant sound of hoofbeats. Tom Whitmore was riding hard back to his father, and Jake had a feeling the real war was about to begin. The next morning brought a different rhythm to the ranch. Jake found himself looking forward to the sound of Maggie's quiet movements in the kitchen, the scratch of her pen as she worked through his accounts, the comfortable way she seemed to understand his need for silence after years of living alone. Over breakfast, she showed him more pages from her journal, detailed records of land deals gone bad, families who'd lost their ranches to mysterious debts, witnesses who'd died in convenient accidents. Her handwriting was precise as a court clerk's, each entry dated and cross-referenced. "Your father know you kept all this?" Jake asked. "He thinks I'm too damaged to be dangerous," Maggie said, pouring herself more coffee from the pot she'd learned to make the way he liked it. "Men like him never believe women are smart enough to plan ahead." They worked together through the morning, her organizing his papers while he repaired a section of fence that had come loose in the wind. When he came back for the noon meal, he found her on the porch, holding something in her lap. It was his old coffee cup, the one with the crack running down one side that he'd been meaning to throw away for months. She'd wrapped thin wire around it and sealed the crack with candle wax, then polished the whole thing until it gleamed. "Thought you might want to keep using it," she said, holding it out to him. "Sometimes broken things hold together better than new ones, if you fix them with care." Jake took the cup and turned it in his hands. The repair was nearly invisible, stronger than the original ceramic. Something tight in his chest loosened as he looked at her steady hands, her careful work, the quiet pride in her face. "Thank you," he said, and meant more than just the cup. That afternoon, she started a small garden behind the cabin. Jake found her there as the sun was setting, kneeling in the dirt she'd turned with his old hoe, planting seeds she'd brought in her traveling bag. Tomatoes, beans, herbs, the kind of things that took months to grow and harvest. "Planning to stick around?" he asked. She looked up at him, dirt on her hands and hope in her eyes. "If you'll have me." The next day was market day in town, and Jake knew it was time to make their arrangement public. Maggie dressed carefully in her best dress, still worn but clean and mended, and wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders. Before they stepped into the general store, Jake did something that surprised them both. He took off his good coat, the black wool one he wore to church and weddings, and settled it around her shoulders over the shawl. "Mr. Sullivan, I couldn't—" "You can, and you will," he said quietly. "Any woman brave enough to save children from a burning building deserves to walk into town with her head high." The coat was too big for her, but it was warm, and it was his, and everyone in town would know what it meant. Jake Sullivan was claiming Margaret Whitmore publicly, putting his reputation behind her dignity. Mrs. Chen, at the laundry, nodded approvingly as they passed. Doc Hollis tipped his hat with genuine respect. But Jake also noticed the conversations that stopped when they approached, the careful way some folks looked everywhere except at Maggie's face. In the general store, while Maggie selected supplies with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to make every penny count, Jake noticed the telegraph operator hurrying out the back door. By the time they'd finished their business, a small crowd had gathered on the store's front porch. "Afternoon, folks," Jake said pleasantly, helping Maggie up onto the wagon seat. Fine day for getting things done. But as they drove home, he saw Maggie looking back at the town with troubled eyes. "They're afraid," she said quietly. "Some are," Jake agreed. "But Mrs. Chen smiled at you, and Doc Hollis took off his hat. Sheriff Wade nodded polite, as you please. Fear's not the only thing in this town, Maggie." That evening, as they sat on the porch, sharing coffee from the mended cup, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet satisfaction of having someone to talk to who understood both silence and words. "Mr. Sullivan," Maggie said, as the stars came out, "I want you to know that whatever happens, these have been the best 3 days I've had in years." Jake looked at her in his coat, her hands wrapped around the cup he'd thought was beyond saving, and realized he was in deeper water than he'd planned. "Jake," he said, "if you're going to stay, you might as well call me Jake." But even as they talked quietly of gardens and weather and the comfortable routines of shared work, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching from the darkness beyond his lamplight. The telegram operator's hurried departure had meant something, and Jake had a feeling they'd find out what very soon. Jake woke to the sound of his horses making noise in the corral, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. The animals were nervous, shifting and snorting in the pre-dawn darkness, and when he stepped outside with his rifle, he could smell what had spooked them: death. In the north pasture, he found 6 head of cattle lying in the grass, their bodies already stiffening in the cold morning air. Poison from the looks of it, quick and clean, no signs of struggle. But what made Jake's jaw tighten was what he found scattered around the carcasses, fresh Whitmore brand irons left behind like calling cards. Maggie found him there as the sun came up, staring down at the dead animals and the message they represented. "How much were they worth?" she asked quietly. "About 3 months' income," Jake said, "but that's not the point." "No," she agreed, looking at the brand irons. The point is that this is just the beginning. They rode into town together that morning. Jake to report the incident to Sheriff Wade, Maggie to pick up supplies at the general store. Jake found Wade in his office looking older than his years and uncomfortable in his own skin. "Sorry to hear about your cattle, Jake," the sheriff said, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet Jake's. "Could have been anyone, I reckon. Lot of bad characters drifting through these days." "Anyone who carries Whitmore branding irons?" Jake asked mildly. Wade's face flushed red. "Now, Jake, you can't go making accusations without proof. The Whitmore family's got a lot of influence in this territory." "I'm sure they do," Jake said, and left the irons on Wade's desk. "Just thought you should know what kind of influence we're dealing with." At the bank, things went from bad to worse. Marcus Webb, the bank manager who'd been friendly enough when Jake took out his loan 2 years back, now looked like a man with stomach trouble. "The thing is, Jake," Webb said, shuffling papers nervously, "there's been some concern about your loan. Nothing serious, you understand, but the board thinks maybe we should review the terms." "What kind of concerns?" "Well, there's talk about your domestic situation. Some folks think maybe you're not making the kind of decisions that show good judgment." Jake leaned back in his chair and studied Webb's sweating face. "Marcus, we've known each other for 5 years. You telling me my judgment's suddenly gone bad?" "It's not me saying it," Webb said quickly. "It's just that when a man makes enemies of the wrong people, what people would those be?" But Webb just mopped his forehead with his handkerchief and mumbled something about needing to discuss it with the board. Jake found Maggie waiting by the wagon, her face pale but determined. "How did your errands go?" she asked. "About like yours, I'd guess," Jake said, noticing how the other shoppers seemed to be giving them a wide berth. "Nobody wants to catch what we've got." That afternoon, Doc Hollis rode out to the ranch, ostensibly to check on Maggie's health, but really to deliver a warning. "Jake, I've been doctoring folks in this territory for 15 years, he said, settling into a porch chair with the careful movements of a man who'd seen too much. "And I can tell you that the injuries this young lady's carrying didn't come from any house fire." He opened his medical bag and pulled out a folder. "I took the liberty of documenting what I found during my examination. Broken bones that healed wrong, burn patterns that don't match her story about the schoolhouse, scars in places that don't make sense." He looked directly at Maggie. "Someone's been hurting you for a long time, miss, and someone's been covering it up." Maggie's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice stayed steady. "What are you going to do with that information, Doctor?" "Keep it safe," Doc Hollis said simply. "Sometimes the truth needs witnesses, and sometimes witnesses need protection." He looked at Jake. "You two have made an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. Silas Whitmore doesn't let go of things he considers his property." As the doctor prepared to leave, he paused at his horse. "Jake, you might want to know that 3 strangers checked into the hotel yesterday. Professional-looking men, if you catch my meaning. They've been asking questions about you and your new wife." After Doc Hollis rode away, Jake and Maggie sat in silence on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains, and thinking about dead cattle and nervous bankers and strangers asking questions. "Jake," Maggie said finally, "I can still leave, before this gets worse." Jake looked at her sitting in his coat, her garden growing behind the house, the mended cup in her hands. "Maggie, I spent 4 years in the cavalry fighting for things I believed in. I'm not about to stop now." But even as he said it, Jake was thinking about those 3 strangers in town and wondering how long they had before Silas Whitmore stopped playing games and started playing for keeps. The answer came the next morning when Jake found fresh horse tracks around his cabin and a message nailed to his door: "Send her home or lose everything you've built." Within a week, Jake's ranch hands had all quit. First, it was young Billy Thompson, mumbling something about his mother taking sick back in Kansas. Then Pete Hawkins claimed his brother needed help with a claim up in Montana. By Friday, even old Miguel Vasquez, who'd worked for Jake since he'd bought the place, came hat in hand to explain about a family emergency that required his immediate attention. "It's not personal, Senor Jake," Miguel said, his weathered face full of regret. "But my Maria, she says the other women in town won't speak to her anymore. My boys, they can't find work. You understand?" Jake understood perfectly. Silas Whitmore was squeezing everyone connected to him, making it clear that association with Jake Sullivan came with a price nobody could afford to pay. With no help, the ranch work fell to Jake and Maggie alone. They rose before dawn to tend the animals, worked through the heat of the day repairing fence and checking water sources, fell into bed exhausted only to wake and do it again. But the harder the work became, the closer they grew, their partnership deepening with each shared task and quiet conversation. The sabotage escalated daily. Fences were cut in the night, forcing cattle to wander onto neighboring ranches where Jake had to pay penalties to retrieve them. Someone poisoned his well, leaving him to haul water from the creek until he could dig a new one. Equipment disappeared or broke in ways that looked accidental but happened too often to be coincidence. "They're trying to break us financially," Maggie said one evening as they tallied the week's losses. Her accounting skills made the damage clear. At this rate, Jake would be bankrupt within 2 months. "Let them try," Jake said grimly. "I've been broke before." But the pressure wasn't just economic. In town, conversation stopped when they approached. The general store was often out of items they needed. The blacksmith was always too busy to take Jake's work. Even the preacher, who'd never missed a chance to discuss the weather before, now nodded politely and hurried past. Only a few people held firm. Mrs. Chen still did their laundry, though she had to take it in through her back door after dark. Doc Hollis continued his visits, checking on Maggie's health and quietly documenting the escalating harassment. The postmistress, widow Sarah Mitchell, continued to greet them with dignified courtesy, though Jake noticed she'd started carrying a small pistol in her apron pocket. "There's still good people in this town," Maggie said, after Sarah slipped her an extra stamp without charging for it. "Good people who are scared people," Jake replied. "Can't blame them for that." The strangers Doc Hollis had mentioned became a regular presence. Jake spotted them watching his ranch from various vantage points, sometimes openly, sometimes trying to be subtle about it. They dressed like businessmen but moved like soldiers, and Jake's cavalry instincts told him these weren't men who'd hesitate to use violence when the time came. One afternoon, as Jake was hauling water from the creek, he found Maggie in deep conversation with someone behind the barn. His hand went automatically to his gun until he recognized Tom Whitmore's horse. But when he rounded the building, he found Maggie alone and shaking. "What did he want?" Jake asked. "To warn me," Maggie said, her voice unsteady. "He says Father's losing patience with the subtle approach. He's planning something bigger." "What kind of something?" Maggie looked at him with frightened eyes. "Tom wouldn't say. But he told me to be ready to run, because when it happens, there won't be time to pack." That night, Jake sat cleaning his rifle while Maggie worked on her journal, adding new entries about the harassment and threats. The lamp cast shifting shadows on the walls, and every sound from outside made them both look up. "Jake," Maggie said quietly, "Tom told me something else." There's a federal marshal who's been asking questions in the territorial capital, questions about land deals and missing people. Jake looked up from his rifle. Federal? Tom thinks Father knows about it. He's scared, Jake. More scared than I've ever seen him. She closed her journal carefully. Tom's been keeping records too, not like mine. He doesn't have access to Father's private papers, but he's been watching, listening. He knows where the bodies are buried. Jake felt something shift in his understanding. You think Tom might be willing to talk to this marshal? I think Tom's been trying to find the courage to talk for years, Maggie said, but he's terrified of what Father will do to him if he finds out. Outside, a nightbird called, then fell silent as if something had disturbed it. Jake moved to the window and peered out into the darkness, his rifle ready. He could see nothing, but his instincts told him they were being watched. Maggie, he said quietly, I think we're about to find out what your father's been planning. In the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, 3 riders sat motionless on the ridge overlooking his ranch. They'd stopped trying to hide their surveillance, which meant only one thing: the time for subtlety was over. Jake woke to the sound of horses surrounding his cabin. In the gray light before dawn, he counted at least 6 riders positioned at strategic points around his property. Professional positioning that told him these weren't cowboys, but hired guns. Maggie was already awake, dressed and sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes on. How long have they been there? She whispered. Long enough to get in position, Jake said, checking his rifle. They're not trying to hide anymore. Through the window, they could see a familiar figure approaching the house. Silas Whitmore himself, riding a black stallion and flanked by 2 armed men. Behind them came a buggy carrying what looked like an official delegation. He brought the whole circus this time, Jake muttered. Maggie moved to the window beside him, and Jake saw her face go pale as winter ice. That's Judge Morrison in the buggy, and Dr. Patterson from the territorial capital. Her voice shook. Jake, they're here to declare me mentally incompetent. Before Jake could respond, Tom Whitmore rode up from the direction of the creek, his horse lathered with sweat as if he'd been riding hard. He dismounted quickly and approached his father's group, speaking in urgent whispers that carried tension even if the words didn't carry. Get dressed, Jake told Maggie. Whatever happens, we meet it standing up. They stepped onto the porch together as Silas Whitmore dismounted. Up close, the cattle baron was smaller than his reputation suggested, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no and meant to keep it that way. Sullivan, Silas said pleasantly, as if this were a social call. I've come to collect my daughter. She's not well, you understand. Needs proper medical care. She looks plenty healthy to me, Jake replied evenly. That's because you're not trained to see the signs, said Dr. Patterson, a thin man with nervous hands who climbed down from the buggy carrying a black medical bag. Miss Whitmore has been suffering from mental instability since her accident. Delusions, paranoid fantasies, inappropriate behavior. Her family has been very patient, but she requires institutional care. Judge Morrison, a heavy-set man with watery eyes, nodded gravely. I have the commitment papers right here, all quite legal and proper. Jake felt Maggie step closer to him, and he could feel her trembling despite her straight posture. What kind of delusions? He asked. She believes her family has been mistreating her, Dr. Patterson said smoothly. She's created elaborate fantasy stories about business dealings she couldn't possibly understand. Classic symptoms of female hysteria combined with brain damage from smoke inhalation. That's interesting, said a new voice, and everyone turned to see Tom Whitmore speaking for the first time. Because I've been wondering about those same business dealings myself, Silas Whitmore's face darkened. "Tom, you will be silent." But Tom stepped forward, his jaw set in a way that reminded Jake strongly of Maggie. "No, Father, I don't think I will. Not anymore." He reached into his coat and pulled out a badge, a federal marshal's star. "My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I've been working with the territorial government to investigate corruption in this district for the past 6 months." The silence that followed was so complete, Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Silas Whitmore's confident expression cracked like thin ice, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he caught himself. "That's impossible," Silas said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Is it?" Tom asked. "Did you really think I was too stupid to see what you were doing? All those ranchers who suddenly couldn't pay their debts, all those convenient accidents, all those missing people who crossed the Whitmore family?" He looked directly at his sister. "All those years of you beating Maggie to keep her quiet about it?" Dr. Patterson cleared his throat nervously. "This is all very dramatic, but it doesn't change the medical facts." "What medical facts?" Tom asked. "The ones you've been paid to fabricate? The ones that will disappear if Maggie dies in your treatment?" He turned to Judge Morrison. "And what about you, Judge? How much is my father paying you to sign those commitment papers?" But before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. A large group of riders was coming up the valley, and as they drew closer, Jake could see they weren't more hired guns. They were townspeople. Mrs. Chen rode side saddle on her old mare. Doc Hollis sat straight in his saddle despite his age. Sheriff Wade looked uncomfortable but determined. Behind them came a dozen others, storekeepers, blacksmiths, farmers, even the preacher. "Looks like word got out about your little party," Jake said to Silas Whitmore. Mrs. Chen rode up to the porch and dismounted with more grace than a woman her age should have possessed. "Mr. Sullivan, Miss Whitmore," she said formally. "We came to make sure everything was conducted proper and legal." Silas Whitmore looked around at the growing crowd, his hired guns, the federal marshal badge still gleaming in Tom's hand. For the first time since Jake had known of him, the cattle baron looked uncertain. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Oh, yes, it is," Tom said quietly. "The federal marshals will be here tomorrow, Father, with warrants. For you, for Judge Morrison, for Dr. Patterson, and for everyone else who's been part of this." He looked at his sister with something that might have been pride. "Maggie's evidence is already in their hands." "Has been for weeks." As Silas Whitmore and his entourage retreated, Jake felt Maggie sag against him with relief. But even as the immediate crisis passed, he could see the hired guns still positioned around his property, and he knew this was only the beginning of the real fight. The battle for Maggie's freedom was about to become a war for their lives. Midnight came with the smell of smoke. Jake woke to orange light flickering against his bedroom walls and the sound of his horses screaming in terror. By the time he'd grabbed his rifle and reached the window, his barn was already fully engulfed, flames leaping toward the star-filled sky. "Jake!" Maggie's voice was sharp with fear. "There's someone moving by the corral." Gunshots cracked through the night air, not aimed at the house, but fired into the air as a warning. Jake could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 positions around his property. Whoever was out there wanted him to know he was surrounded, trapped like an animal while his livelihood burned. "Stay low," Jake told Maggie, leading her away from the windows. "They want us scared, not dead, yet." But even as he said it, Jake was thinking about his cavalry days, about defensive positions and fields of fire. The cabin was well built, with thick log walls, but it had too many windows and only 2 doors. If they wanted to take it, they could. The question was, what were they waiting for? The answer came with the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the hired guns, but help. Jake recognized Doc Hollis's voice shouting in the darkness, followed by Mrs. Chen calling out in rapid Chinese to someone Jake couldn't see. "What in the Sam Hill?" Jake peered out the window and saw something that made him blink twice to be sure he wasn't dreaming. Half the town was riding into his yard, armed with rifles and shotguns and the kind of grim determination Jake hadn't seen since the war. Mrs. Chen carried a double-barreled shotgun that looked older than the territory itself. The blacksmith, Henrik Larsen, had brought his sons and what appeared to be most of his anvils loaded into a wagon to use as cover. Even Sheriff Wade was there, though he looked like a man who'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Jake," Doc Hollis called out. "You folks all right in there?" Jake opened the door cautiously, keeping his rifle ready. "Doc, what are you doing here?" "Young Tom Whitmore came riding through town about an hour ago," Doc Hollis said, dismounting with his medical bag slung over his shoulder. "Said his father's men were planning to finish this tonight, before the federal marshals arrive tomorrow. So we decided to have a little gathering, Mrs. Chen added calmly, as if barn burning and midnight standoffs were perfectly normal social events. "Make sure everyone behaves properly." Jake looked around at the faces gathered in his yard, people who'd been afraid to speak to him just days ago, now standing armed and ready to face down Silas Whitmore's hired guns. "You folks could get hurt. This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't," said Henrik Larsen, his Swedish accent thick with anger. "That bastard Whitmore's been squeezing this town for years. Time someone stood up to him." Sheriff Wade stepped forward reluctantly. "Jake, I got word from the territorial capital tonight. Federal marshals are definitely coming in the morning with warrants. If we can keep this situation calm until then." A rifle shot cracked from the ridge, and everyone dove for cover. But the bullet went high, another warning shot. "Doesn't sound like they're interested in keeping things calm," Jake observed. As if in response to his words, a voice called out from the darkness beyond the burning barn. "Sullivan, send out the woman, and we'll let the rest of you go." Jake felt Maggie step up beside him, and he saw she'd grabbed his spare rifle from above the fireplace. "Over my dead body," she said quietly. "That can be arranged," the voice called back. Doc Hollis was already moving between the townspeople, checking their defensive positions with the efficiency of a man who'd served as a field surgeon during the war. "Henrik, get those anvils positioned to cover the north approach. Mrs. Chen, you and your shotgun take the porch, best field of fire from there. Sheriff, much as it pains me to say it, you might want to decide whose side you're really on." Wade looked around at the determined faces surrounding him, then at the burning barn, then back at Jake. "Hell," he muttered, and pulled out his own rifle. Never did like bullies anyway. The siege lasted until dawn, but it wasn't the kind of warfare Jake had expected. Instead of a direct assault, it became a battle of nerves and positioning. The hired guns stayed hidden in the darkness, taking occasional shots to keep everyone on edge, while the townspeople settled into defensive positions and waited for sunrise. During a quiet moment, Jake found himself next to Tom Whitmore, who'd appeared sometime during the night with his federal marshal's badge and a rifle of his own. "Your father really think he can shoot his way out of federal charges?" Jake asked. Tom's laugh was bitter. "My father's never faced a situation he couldn't buy, bully, or burn his way out of. He doesn't understand that some things can't be fixed with money and violence." "What about you? You understand?" Tom looked at his sister, who was calmly reloading rifles with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to handle firearms out of necessity. "I understand that I've been a coward for too long," he said simply, "and that Maggie's worth 10 of me." As the sky began to lighten, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. The hired guns were pulling back, disappearing into the dawn mist like ghosts. Either they were retreating, or they were repositioning for something worse. The answer came with the sound of a single rider approaching under a white flag. It was Silas Whitmore himself, looking older and more desperate than Jake had ever seen him. "I want to talk," he called out. "Just talk." Jake stepped out onto his porch, the townspeople's rifles trained on the cattle baron. "Say your piece, Whitmore." "This has gone too far," Silas said, his voice carrying a tremor Jake had never heard before. "People are going to get killed. Good people." "Should have thought of that before you burned my barn," Jake replied. "I'm prepared to offer a settlement," Silas continued desperately. "Money. Land. Whatever you want. Just let me take my daughter home, and we'll call this finished." Before Jake could answer, Maggie stepped forward. In the growing light, Jake could see years of fear and rage burning in her eyes like the flames that had consumed his barn. "I am not your daughter," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "I am not your property, and I am not going anywhere with you." She raised her rifle and aimed it directly at her father's chest. "The only place you're going, old man, is prison." The sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the morning air. A large group riding hard from the direction of town. Jake could see the glint of federal badges in the early sunlight, and he felt something tight in his chest finally begin to loosen. The cavalry had arrived at last. But even as relief flooded through him, Jake noticed that Silas Whitmore was smiling, and that smile made his blood run cold. Whatever the old man had planned, it wasn't over yet. The territorial courthouse had never seen such a crowd. By noon, every seat was filled, and people stood 3 deep along the walls. Word had spread throughout the territory that Silas Whitmore was finally going to face justice, and it seemed like half of Wyoming had come to watch. Jake sat in the front row beside Maggie, who looked calm and dignified in the blue dress Mrs. Chen had pressed for her that morning. Tom sat with the federal prosecutors, his marshal's badge catching the light from the tall windows. Sheriff Wade had arrested Silas Whitmore at dawn without incident. The cattle baron had surrendered peacefully, almost as if he'd been expecting it. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Silas looked too confident for a man facing federal charges. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison," the bailiff called. Jake felt Maggie stiffen beside him as the same heavy-set man who'd tried to sign her commitment papers the day before entered the courtroom in black robes. "Jake," Maggie whispered urgently, "that's the corrupt judge, the one my father bought." But as Morrison took his place behind the bench, something strange happened. He removed his judicial wig and set it aside, then reached into his robes and pulled out a badge identical to Tom's. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a voice that carried easily through the packed courtroom, "my name is Federal Marshal William Crawford, and I've been conducting an undercover investigation into corruption in this territory for the past 8 months." The explosion of voices was so loud that Crawford had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Jake looked at Silas Whitmore and saw the cattle baron's confident expression cracking like thin ice. "That's impossible," Silas said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Judge Morrison and I we've had business arrangements for years." "Yes, you have," Crawford agreed pleasantly. "And I've documented every bribe, every false ruling, every illegal land seizure," he nodded to Tom. with considerable help from your son, who's been working with us since last winter." Silas turned to stare at Tom with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You betrayed me, your own father." "No," Tom said quietly, standing up to face the man who'd terrorized him his entire life. "I stopped betraying myself." Marshal Crawford opened a thick folder on his desk. "This hearing will determine the mental competency of Miss Margaret Whitmore as requested by her family. Miss Whitmore, please take the stand." Maggie walked to the witness chair with her head high, and Jake felt pride swell in his chest. This was the woman who'd survived years of abuse, who'd documented every crime her family committed, who'd never given up hope of escape. "Miss Whitmore," Crawford said gently, "can you tell us about your relationship with your family?" What followed was the most powerful testimony Jake had ever heard. In a clear, steady voice, Maggie described years of systematic abuse designed to keep her silent about her family's crimes. She spoke of being beaten for asking questions about missing neighbors, of being locked in her room for weeks at a time, of being told repeatedly that she was worthless and damaged. But she also spoke of hope, of secret record-keeping that had taken years to compile, of a teacher's training that had helped her document evidence with scientific precision, of a determination to see justice done not just for herself, but for all the families her father had destroyed. "Do you have this evidence with you today?" Crawford asked. "I do." Maggie reached into her bag and pulled out the leather journal Jake had seen her writing in so many times. Every bribe, every illegal land deal, every act of violence committed by Silas Whitmore and his associates over the past 5 years. The courtroom erupted again as Maggie handed over the journal. Jake could see Silas Whitmore's face growing paler by the moment. "Dr. Patterson," Crawford called, "you examined Miss Whitmore and declared her mentally incompetent. Do you stand by that assessment?" The nervous doctor stood up, mopping his face with a handkerchief. "Your Honor, I may have been hasty in my diagnosis. Further examination might be warranted." "Further examination by whom? By you, the man who accepted $500 from Silas Whitmore to fabricate a medical report?" Dr. Patterson sat down abruptly, his face flushed with shame. Crawford turned back to Maggie. "Miss Whitmore, in your opinion, which member of your family shows signs of mental instability?" Maggie looked directly at her father for the first time since the hearing began. "The man who believes he can murder his neighbors, steal their land, beat his daughter, and face no consequences for any of it," she said clearly. "That man is dangerously disconnected from reality." The gavel came down with finality. "I find Margaret Whitmore to be entirely competent, both mentally and legally. Furthermore, I order the immediate arrest of Silas Whitmore on charges of bribery, fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder." As federal marshals moved to arrest the cattle baron, Silas Whitmore looked around the courtroom with wild eyes. "You can't do this," he shouted. "I own half the politicians in this territory. I have connections in Washington." "Had," Crawford corrected mildly. "Past tense. Those connections have been severed." But even as the marshals put handcuffs on Silas Whitmore, Jake noticed something that made him uneasy. The old man had stopped struggling and was looking at Maggie with an expression Jake couldn't read. "This isn't over, girl," Silas said quietly as they led him away. "You think you've won, but you don't know what winning costs." Maggie watched her father disappear through the courthouse doors, and Jake saw tears on her cheeks for the first time since he'd known her. "It's over," she whispered. But Jake, watching the faces of the people in the courtroom, some celebrating, some stunned, some calculating what this meant for their own arrangements with the Whitmore empire, wasn't so sure. Justice had been served, But in his experience, the aftermath of justice was often more complicated than the crime itself. 6 months later, Jake stood on his porch drinking coffee from the mended cup and watching his wife tend the garden that now covered half an acre behind their house. The word still felt strange in his mind. Wife. They'd been married by the circuit preacher 2 weeks after the trial, in a ceremony attended by half the town and blessed by the kind of spring rain that promised good growing weather. The ranch was thriving. With Silas Whitmore's empire dismantled and his stolen lands returned to their rightful owners, the artificial shortages and inflated prices had disappeared overnight. Jake's cattle were fat and healthy. His new barn was twice the size of the one that had burned, and he'd hired back Miguel and his sons to help with the expanded operation. But the biggest change was in the town itself. With the Whitmore stranglehold broken, honest business could flourish again. New families were moving in, children filled the schoolhouse where Maggie taught 3 days a week, and there was talk of the railroad finally extending a spur line through the valley. "Jake," Maggie called from the garden, where she was picking tomatoes in the dress that had once been her best, but now served for everyday wear. She had new dresses now, made by Mrs. Chen with fabric that didn't have to be counted by the penny, but she still moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste anything. "What is it?" he called back, though he could see from her smile that it was good news. Tom got a letter from the territorial capital. The federal prosecutors say Silas will be in prison for the rest of his life. 23 separate convictions, including 2 for murder. Jake nodded, feeling a satisfaction that was deeper than simple revenge. Justice, real justice, was a rare thing on the frontier, and seeing it served completely was worth savoring. Tom had stayed in the territory, working as a full federal marshal now, trying to undo years of his father's corruption. It wasn't easy work. Some of the damage could never be fully repaired. But Tom approached it with the same methodical determination his sister brought to her teaching and record-keeping. The 3 of them had dinner together every Sunday, an odd little family bound not by blood, but by shared survival, and the recognition that some things mattered more than the circumstances of your birth. Mrs. Chen had become the town's unofficial coordinator of good works, organizing assistance for the families who'd lost everything to Whitmore's schemes. Doc Hollis served as the new territorial medical examiner, ensuring that suspicious deaths received proper investigation. Even Sheriff Wade had found his backbone, running for mayor on a platform of honest government and community self-reliance. "Jake," Maggie said as they settled onto the porch that evening, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Tom hadn't had the courage to contact the federal marshals?" Jake thought about it, watching the sunset paint the plains the same gold color they'd been the night she arrived. "I reckon we'd have found another way. You're too smart and too stubborn to stay beaten down forever." Maggie smiled and lifted the mended cup to her lips. The repair was still visible, a thin line of silver wire that caught the light, but the cup was stronger now than it had ever been when it was whole. "Sometimes I think about that driver," she said quietly. "The one who brought me here like I was something shameful that needed to be hidden away. What about him? I wonder if he knew he was delivering me to exactly where I belonged." Jake looked at his wife. The word came easier now, sitting in the chair she'd claimed as her own, wearing the coat he'd given her that first day in town, surrounded by the garden she'd planted and the life they'd built together from nothing but mutual respect and stubborn hope. "Maybe he did," Jake said. "Maybe sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened." Maggie reached over and took his hand, her fingers still carrying the ink stains that marked her as a woman who worked with words and numbers and the kind of careful documentation that could bring down empires. "Jake Sullivan," she said, "do you know what I've learned in all of this?" "What's that?" "That the most beautiful souls often come wrapped in packages the world wants to throw away, and that sometimes the family that rejects you just makes room for the family that will treasure you." As the stars came out over the Wyoming plains, Jake squeezed her hand and thought about second chances and mended things and the way love could grow in the most unexpected soil. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, cattle to tend, accounts to balance, a community to help rebuild. But tonight, there was peace, and coffee shared between two people who'd found exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. In the distance, a nightbird called, and this time it sang without fear. "Now, friend, I want to talk to you for a moment, if you'll allow an old storyteller that privilege. You've just heard the tale of Jake Sullivan and Margaret Whitmore, two people who found each other when the world had written them both off as finished goods. But I suspect you've known folks like them in your own life, people who carried more worth than the world could see, people who found strength in the places where they'd been broken. See, here's what I've learned in my years of watching human nature play itself out across this great country of ours. The measure of a person isn't in how pretty they are, or how much money their daddy left them, or whether they've got the right connections in the right places. The measure of a person is in what they do when everything's stacked against them, when the easy path is to give up, when standing up means standing alone. Jake Sullivan could have taken one look at Maggie's scars and sent her packing, the way her family expected him to. Would have been the practical thing, the safe thing. But Jake had learned something in his years, that real beauty isn't skin deep, and real strength isn't in the arm that strikes, but in the heart that protects. And Maggie, well, Maggie could have spent her life believing what her family told her, that she was damaged goods, worthless, something to be hidden away. Instead, she chose to document the truth, to prepare for her moment, to believe that somewhere there was a person who would see her for what she really was. That takes a special kind of courage, the quiet kind that doesn't make speeches or wave flags, but just keeps putting one foot in front of the other when the whole world says you ought to lay down and quit. I think about that mended cup sometimes, how Maggie fixed it with wire and wax until it was stronger than it had ever been when it was perfect. That's what love does to broken people, isn't it? It doesn't pretend the cracks aren't there, doesn't try to hide the scars. Instead, it honors them, strengthens them, turns them into something beautiful. Maybe you've got some cracks of your own. Maybe the world's told you that you're past your usefulness, that your best days are behind you, that nobody's interested in what you have to offer anymore. If that's so, I want you to remember Jake and Maggie, and I want you to remember this. Sometimes the most valuable things come disguised as throwaway packages. In a world that judges everything by the surface, be like Jake Sullivan. Look deeper. Because the person sitting next to you in church, the neighbor who keeps to himself, the woman at the grocery store who always counts her change twice, any one of them might be carrying more wisdom, more strength, more love than all the pretty people put together. And if you're feeling like Maggie, like the world's decided you're not worth much anymore, well, you just remember that there's always someone out there who needs exactly what you have to offer. Your scars tell a story of survival. Your age speaks of experience. Your quiet strength has been tested by fire and found genuine. Sometimes the family that throws you away just makes room for the family that will treasure you. If this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you used to be, I hope you'll share it with folks who might need to hear it. We've got too many people in this world who think they're finished, and not nearly enough who understand that broken things, when mended with care, can be the strongest things of all. Until we meet again, friend, remember to look past the surface. Real treasure often comes in the most unexpected packages.